Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Pricing Key Trends You Can't Ignore for 2021. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event, as well as a reminder about accessing today's content on demand. You've joined the presentation listening via your computer's audio by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone in the audio pane and the dial-in information, if where available, will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and, time permitting, address them during the live Q&A session towards the end of today's session. As a reminder, all registrants will receive an email containing a link to download the presentation slides, along with an on-demand playback of today's live session. I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. We also have with us Abhishek Sharma, partner. He leads Everest Group's pricing assurance practice and assists clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and sourcing cost rationalization. Also with us today, Amy Fong, Vice President. She leads the firm's offerings for sourcing and vendor management teams, including market intelligence and price benchmarking, memberships, and custom research. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael.
All right, thank you, Joy. So, wow, what a year. You know, I was just looking back at where we were this time last year, and we were thinking about planning for 2020. And you know, the number 1, 2, and 3 issues we were worried about in a geopolitical kind of business setting was Brexit, U.S.-China trade war, and the uncertainty around the election, especially in the U.S. Those were all our top concerns. Nowhere on there was the global pandemic, and so as we all know, it hit us like a ton of bricks in the end of Q1, and it's been an interesting year, I can say. But I also have to say that I've been absolutely thrilled, having been part of the outsourcing industry for 3+ decades. Absolutely proud of how this industry has responded, both on a delivery standpoint and I can honestly say that nobody truly planned for a global pandemic. There might have been people that had some ideas that maybe this could happen, but never really truly planned for it. So we have done exceedingly well as an industry from both a service provider as well as a buyer standpoint. We've responded to the task and the challenges in ways that everybody is good to go on. So now, having said that, there's still a lot of economic uncertainty out there. Cost takeout has been a major theme for many organizations, getting cost certainty. That's not true for all industries, but for many industries, the economic uncertainty has caused changes in the business plans, with outsourcing being something that's been seen as an opportunity to reduce cost, as also as an opportunity to improve service levels or change service levels as we go forward here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, Amy and Abhishek are going to talk about a number of different elements of where we see pricing and pricing actions happening in 2021. But let's start with our convictions here. And so, you know, we start out here with this as an unprecedented buyer's market. And I would say that was especially true in the middle of the year. Revenues were down for outsourcing service providers just about across the board. We've seen a significant pickup here in the end of Q3, the beginning of Q4. So we'll see if that continues, but an opportunity to really go back and think about how we want to do business differently going forward here. Organizations, as I've indicated here, are looking at the inherent waste to attack the inherent waste that there may be in their contracts. Things they weren't concerned about, looking back and saying, hey, here's what we can do to drive some efficiencies and make the deals better, make them even think about it in a win-win context. Abhishek, you want to talk a little bit about these last 3 convictions?
Sure, thanks, Michael. So this is interesting, right? So we often get a lot of questions around, what's the movement from one pricing model to the other. So, of course, there's significant activity to shift away from staff augmentation to more managed models, giving more accountability to service providers. So that's in line with better cost control, higher scalability, etc. So that's a given. Having said that, right, managed services is a step change, which works very well for some enterprises, right? But there are certain prerequisites which we will talk about in the next few minutes. There could still be organizations which may not be as mature, right? So in that case, time and material may be better. Now, I know as a fact, T&M gets some bad rep, and there's a lot of desire to move away. But the sheer simplicity of that model actually means that for certain situations, it may be the right answer in the short to medium term before a certain maturity is achieved. Finally, one of the things we're seeing is clients are becoming much more conscious of what's the underlying mechanics behind any fixed price engagement, right? Gone are the days when the desire was, hey, let's just move all risk to the service provider, have them quote a fixed fee so that we don't worry. The concept of risk premium is much better understood by the enterprise today than it was a few years ago. So rather than just simply lop over all the risk to the service provider side, clients are now thinking that what could be the best way to manage it rather than just think of it as a hot potato and give it away. So these are some of our convictions, some of which we'll talk about in the next few minutes.
Yeah, and Abhishek, I think that's interesting. I know have been part of this industry for a long time. When you talk about moving to managed services models, I would to reflect back and say, we prior to staff augmentation out of India or labor arbitrage out of India, just about everything in the industry was actually a managed service model. So it was based on outputs for the most part. It wasn't until up to around 15 years ago or so that we actually started to see more of the T&M models. So we're kind of back to the future in that regard. So it's kind of fun to see that in our industry as we start to think about where we go from here. So with that, let's talk about the focus of this webinar. It's about contracting model shifting. So we're going to talk about that as we kind of indicated. We want to give you a little bit of data in terms of our pricing trends and what we see there, and then we're going to talk about things as we move forward, how we see that playing out for 2021. Quickly, our sources of data come here from actually looking at deals in context in real life. We're seeing those deals flow from the industry. We have a lot of contract reviews we do, and then we also have many discussions. Abhishek and Amy's teams are constantly talking about this topic with clients, and so we're able to glean not only numerical information but also contextual information about what's important. So let's talk about the outline for today. We'll talk about the model trends, we'll talk about pricing, and then we'll talk about looking forward here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy. Amy, what are you hearing from your clients about things as we think about this topic?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Abhishek, and everyone for joining us today. I wanted to really talk about some of the trends around contracting models up front before we get to pricing, because I think that this is an important thing to think about, and Abhishek alluded to a couple of key points in the slides earlier. There's a number of things people are doing to reshape their pricing models or their contracting models that are affecting their cost structure overall. And two of them are contract simplification and then pricing model restructuring. So when we think about simplification, what we're seeing is that as portfolios have grown and we're kind of on this everything is on the table, one of the things we look at is how consistent they are and whether we have optimized terms across our multiple different contracts. So we're seeing enterprises trying to rationalize the set of service providers they have. We have a number of them who are coming to us saying, we've got 10 doing X activity, or we've got 5 and we want to go to 3. And at the same time, they're looking at how do we make our SOWs or our other schedules more consistent? How do we change the credit regime, service credit regimes, productivity clauses, benchmarking clauses, things like that, that can make it easier to manage these contracts and execute on an ongoing basis. At the same time, we started to allude to some changes in pricing models. And what we're finding is that different business models may have different model pricing structures for the same type of service. So there's a lot of recalibration happening there. In fact, we'll show some data on Agile pricing models in a few slides that really backs up this point. Looking at, does a one-size-fits-all approach work? And how do we switch to more output or outcome-based models? We'll talk about what some of those look like in a minute. But really, we need to align these agreements and the pricing model with the complexity, with the predictability of the work, how well we can forecast volumes, whether they're scalable, whether there's something more niche that's maybe a short-term need or a isolated need for one business unit. And there's a variety of different models that can work. And we'll try to hit on a couple of those today before we get into some of the more numeric type discussions or pricing based trends.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Amy, for that background. There's a lot of pricing model change, simplification activity going on. Much of it also has to do with a lot of vendor consolidation that's happening now. That's talk for another day, right? Vendor consolidation, another major theme. But I just want to take a step back, right, and see, there is an intent to evolve pricing models, correct? But it's also important to understand what really drives, or may I say, should drive the best fit pricing model for each situation. There's a lot of instances where we say, hey, we want to go output based, we want outcome based, or we want to move from per FTE to per call to per minute of call. We keep on having these discussions, but fundamentally, what are the three key tenets which define the best fit pricing model? First of all, what's the objective and incentive? Right? If it's about scalability, lower cost, industrialization, there are some pricing models which are better suited. If, on the other hand, it's all about that user experience, innovation, right? Having the flexibility to think on the ground, the pricing models will be different. So it's important to first off start with the objectives and incentives. Second, and I guess the most important, is what really are the service characteristics? Right? What's the contours? What do they look like? Complexity, homogeneity of work, predictability, data security. All of these factors come into play. And I'll give you an example. Anything which is to do with knowledge-based work, or where there's a lot of uncertainty, where you can't box everything into some kind of a standard catalog. Obviously, in that case, it's going to be difficult to get into more output-based or highly standardized models. Right? In that case, a simpler model may make sense because the objectives and the characteristics are different. And then finally, who is best placed to manage the risk of resource underutilization, right? Because the moment you change pricing and commercial models, some amount of risk gets passed on from one party to the other. The trick for the most optimal model is who is best placed to manage that risk in as cheap and in as inexpensive a way as possible, right? So, fundamentally, it's very important to look at these key elements while deciding any best fit pricing model for a situation. And I think, Eddie, this is a good segue into perhaps the evolution of models that you want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. I think those 3 points or 3 dimensions are really important to think about, and I would suggest the audience kind of keep those in mind when you're thinking about which of the models we're going to talk about is the right fit for you. And I hit on a few more details here about things to consider. When we look at the evolving models in outsourcing, managed services has become the goal for many. There's a lot of several other models that still exist, and I wouldn't say just exist, but are proliferate here, starting with the very traditional staff aug capacity service type model where you're just bringing on resources, the client is managing the resources and managing the outcomes. Co-sourcing, kind of a capacity service when you're bringing on specialized skills and the client or the buyer company is still owning most of the aspects of the delivery and the outcomes. And then there's project-based outsourcing, which is probably what a lot of us think of, where it's more end-to-end ownership of the partner, the service provider, and the service provider is really held accountable for outcomes. Managed services, though, is we're handing over much greater end-to-end accountability for the business outcomes to a service provider. And typically, we think of this as an as-a-service type engagement model, or there's an option for as-a-service engagement models as part of this. So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about which of these work and when these work and when they don't, right? Each of these models has a place in the time. And I think the 3 dimensions that Abhishek shared earlier is a good place to start. But when you think about some of the pros and the cons of each model, a lot of it gets back to your internal maturity and what you're able to manage just as much as what the service provider is able to deliver. So staff aug and co-sourcing models, those are great if you need, simpler scaling up and down of resources. You're fairly comfortable with this model. You've got a service provider who's just going to be kind of an extension of the arm. Not so good in the sense that you have challenges to budget upfront, right? You can't necessarily forecast your spend. The provider does not have a lot of incentive to introduce productivity improvements or to share the risk here. And a lot of people are outsourcing these days to accelerate their digital transformation and increase productivity. If your provider doesn't have incentive to do that, you're probably not going to see it. We like to say innovation isn't free. So if you're not paying for it somewhere in a separate bucket, you're not going to see that automatically materialize. The provider also has some incentive here to increase their billing, either adding number of people, typically adding number of people or skill levels or position levels in ways that don't necessarily address client challenges. So that can potentially get out of control if you're not monitoring it. Project-based engagements are kind of the in-between here. There is more ownership from the service provider for a specific engagement. They have some incentive to introduce those productivity gains. And if their payments are linked to a project outcome, they're really driving for goals that are aligned with the business. From a cons perspective, the downside here is that the client environment needs to have a reasonable level of sourcing maturity. A lot of making this effective comes down to how you manage on a day-to-day basis. If you have a VMO that's managing this as if it's staff aug, that might not get the outcomes that you want, and you may not be able to hold the service provider accountable in the end. Clients also need to have evolved their governance and project management practices. So, you can't manage it as you would a simple staff aug headcount. You need to give some control to the service provider. Not every organization is comfortable with that. And of course, not every service provider takes on that control effectively as well. So there's a balance there. When we talk about managed services, this is really the further end of the spectrum. There's a lot of benefits to managed services. So you're sharing the risk between the provider with the provider. You're making them accountable for overall service delivery. There's usually some incentives that align with business outcomes. So this is really everybody's running towards the same goal, right? The provider has an intent or vested interest in bringing in productivity improvements, managing talent effectively, maybe even doing some digital improvements or transformational improvements into the system. They also can bring best practices of efficiency and process maturity. That's really what you're hiring them for, to take the process and make it better. The challenge here, again, like I mentioned earlier, you've got to have higher sourcing maturity. You can't just manage this like it's project-based. There is significant due diligence required during the contracting process. So you're probably not going to get to a managed service model through a traditional RFP process that's just guided by sourcing. There's a lot more developing the business model and back and forth between the parties. And it does take more requirements definition up front. We strongly believe you can have an effective managed services model, but I think a lot of what we'll talk about today and some of the points we're making are based on the challenges we've seen people run into when they're trying to introduce this type of model or trying to manage this type of model in a less mature organization. Michael, do you want to jump in with a poll and just get a read on the people on the line?
Yeah, before we go there, I just want to make a comment here. As Amy's speaking about these different pricing models here, it's also important to note the scope of the work that's being outsourced makes a difference here. So if it's a BPO contract, there's a much higher propensity to be output based, more managed service. If the scope is applications development and maintenance, the tendency is to be more in the staff augmentation. And so I think there's a, you got to pay attention to the scope as it applies, and that will also somewhat dictate the pricing model that goes with that. Now, what Amy said and what Abhishek said, that's changing, but there is a historical basis for based on scope. So with that, let's go to the quick poll. So Amy's going to open it, or Amanda's going to open it up here for you to input your data and put your inputs in here. Let's just open that up here. Okay, so what % of your outsourcing contracts are based on time and materials? So we want to see where your perspective is on that. And okay. We got almost half now. We'll keep it open for another 5 seconds here. Okay, now we're going way over half. Okay, great. All right, so it's a virtual horse race here. If you look at it here, it's all over the board, and I think that's going to largely go to the scope that I was referring to and the maturity that Amy was referring to. Less than 25% is almost exactly the same as 50 to 26 to 50 and 51 to 75. Only a few said that all their contracts have time and material. So anyway, so good mix there. I think again, this will continue to evolve over time. I think as labor arbitrage becomes less of the equation, that also comes into play. All right, so let's move on to the next chapter, if you will. And
yeah,
Amy, you can take this one, right?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So, we're going to dig a little deeper on this just in the example of Agile. Obviously, the models we shared earlier really apply to any kind of outsourcing, any process, could be BPO, could be ITS, IT services. But when we look specifically at Agile, this is a common area we get questions on because of the transition of many IT organizations and just the mode of Agile specifically. So we recently did a quick poll on Agile development projects that looked at the mix of pricing model elements our clients were using. And what we found was that most were using 5 to 6 different types of pricing, different elements of pricing. And so if you look across this on the right side, most are using TNM, fixed fee, many with per output, target model, cap TNM, and about 40% of their projects had some of these pricing, one of these pricing elements, each of them involved. So quite a variety. I would question whether the complexity of managing this type of multi-model model is more complexity than we should be introducing. But I also think that to the points that we mentioned earlier, there's some really good reasons for this. Putting the right team or putting teams or business units in models that are appropriate for their level of maturity, for instance, or for the type of work they're doing. So Abhishek, why don't you talk a little bit more about what works in an Agile model, because that's a question that I get all the time from my clients.
Yeah, sure, Amy, and absolutely. As was evident in the survey results as well, it's a whole range or a whole continuum of models which enterprises are using, and there's good enough reason for that. Right? That's how I see it. So if we look at the whole range, if we start with the simplest one, right? And there was a lot of clients, especially in the survey, the respondents who did mention time and material. Right? Like I said, sometimes CNM does tend to get a bad rep, but it's very suitable for initial stages or for projects which don't have previous reference points. Now, Agile by definition is all about learning as you go, thinking as you go, without really trying to time box, or maybe time box, but not trying to kind of just fix or tie in the scope from day one. Right? So that's where some of that flexibility and simplicity which time and material gives is helpful. Right? Now, having said that, it does have some downsides. That there's an element of potential uncontrolled spending and, one might say, poor service provider accountability, which is where the fixed capacity or Agile pod model comes into play. Right? It's still input based, It takes some of the concerns. It takes care of some of the concerns of time and material, where a certain minimum throughput can be agreed upon and baked in, right? So it has the benefits of both worlds. There's flexibility, visibility, simplicity, but again, some degree of continuous improvement can be baked in. Target price is honestly not very common. Right? It's used, but not something which you'll see very often. But it can be helpful in cases where trust has been built. There's mature scope estimation, and both parties then agree that, hey, the unknowns are the unknowns. Let's just take a risk reward mechanism that, hey, this is the target price. If it overshoots, we share the overshooting. If it comes beneath that, we share the benefits, right? So it's for those where the trust is there, estimation models are there, but perhaps not to the level where you can really agree on a per story point model, which I'll just talk about. The fixed fee model is where it needs to be seen with a little bit of a tweak. It's not about fixing the scope per se. It's about obviously using some mature estimation methods to understand what the story points are, right? What's the number of story points which can then be put into a fixed budget, and then you work around it. Now, for Agile, in the flexibility which can come into play is that similar effort user stories can be changed along the way, right? So it's not that you're absolutely fixed on the scope. It's just that some kind of equivalent effort of user stories can be tweaked. So again, that's a bit of a mix. Now, the in terms of accountability, the other extreme from time and material is basically output based, right? That's where people agree, both parties agree on something like a price per story point, and the vendor only gets paid once that story point or user story gets delivered, right? Now, from an accountability perspective, it might be very attractive. Provider takes a lot of risk, but then again, it needs a lot of maturity, history in the relationship, and therefore, it is predicated on the effort estimation maturity. In fact, we've seen many enterprises who themselves have built up reference libraries of how much effort it takes, what's the number of story points, how does that translate into overall effort. So it's not that everything needs to be brought in by the provider, right? It's also a joint effort by that. So all of these models have their own place. Like Amy mentioned, a number of enterprises at any given point in time may be using all or a large number of them, just depending on the scope. So that's something to be mindful of. If we move slightly away from Agile, right? I'd also mentioned a few minutes ago around the prerequisites or what are the fundamentals which drive a best fit pricing model. And there's a desire to get into managed services, and I mentioned that I would talk about some of the prerequisites for a managed services benefit model. So some of these I'll just list out, right? First of all, there's got to be some homogeneous output units. The units of delivery should be discrete, measurable, with the same standard. Anything which has a high degree of variation in that unit automatically makes it slightly unsuitable for managed services. The second element is predictable volume fluctuation, right? So volume fluctuations are fine as long as they're predictable or within certain limits. If there's a lot of seesawing or ups and downs which are highly unpredictable, can it be delivered in a managed service? Yes. What it means is the main R word, right? The risk then becomes, the risk of underutilization or overutilization then becomes so high, then one wonders, is there going to be commercial benefit in moving to a managed services model? The only exception here on point number 2 would be that if the vendor is proposing a shared model where the same resources could work on multiple accounts, then in that case it might be different. But because a lot of clients want dedicated, and dedicated units serving them, it becomes a tad difficult. Repeatability and high volume transactions are critical. Judgment-based services, like I mentioned, like knowledge services, etc., they don't tend to be suitable because there's just so much variability. There's just so much, they're low volume. There may not be as much repeatability as well. So that's important to consider. The fourth point, I guess, is the most important. And again, towards the end of today's session, we'll talk about a couple of case studies, one of which, speaks about this very problem. One cannot improve what one cannot measure. I haven't said that. It's someone else who said that, but it's very applicable here. Right? A strong sense of transaction volumes and associated effort is critical in my mind to maintain an equitable price, right? So without that baseline availability, it again means that the provider is taking a lot of assumptions. Whenever the provider takes assumptions, they will bake in the risk of the unknown, which is very natural. And then finally, the cultural aspect, you have to cede some control. Right? Managed service means that the provider is accountable. There can be no accountability without the right level of responsibility and control given to the vendor. If there is if there is very low willingness to cede control, or the internal organizational dynamics are such that it could cause problems, then that could be an issue. So again, these are some of those considerations which we've just condensed into a few points to think through for organizations as they move from one model to the other. Amy, you want to talk about some of those change management aspects as well?
Yeah, let's talk about some of the success factors, because those are great points on what makes it not work, right? On the flip side, or what the impact of some of those challenges are. Or misalignments, I guess is a better word. What success factors are to really embrace this change? The first is a clear understanding of your sourcing strategy. So you, not just as the category manager or the IT leader or whatever, need to be able to answer the questions. Why are we outsourcing? What are we outsourcing? How, when, and who? Really all aligned on that same strategy. You can't be questioning it once you've turned over the keys, right? There's just too much friction in that type of a culture. Business alignment is really important as well, and that goes hand in hand with the sourcing strategy. That impacted groups in IT as well as in the business unit understand the process. They understand the connections to the decision and how this is going to work. Being aligned on the outcomes is very important. It's also important to have very clear scope and definition on the services that are going to be delivered. So those that'll be going to the service provider versus those that are retained or aligned in the selected engagement model. I've seen situations in specifically in procurement outsourcing where which projects will the service provider take and which will stay in-house, and it was done fairly ad hoc. And go figure that the internal category managers kept all the high value projects, sourcing projects, whereas the BPO provider was given sort of the lower, the high hanging fruit, I guess, the lower return on investment projects. And you can't do that in an ad hoc kind of way, because it's not going to drive the kind of ROI that you're looking for from a service provider. Transition management. So change management and transition management are incredibly important. Transition kind of being that first, deploying an office or a team that can do a rigorous knowledge management and stand up the service provider, work through processes across the delivery groups, identify and mitigate the transition risks. Governance, also important. Governance is really the ongoing definition and structures and processes to manage the service providers and any vendors, including relationship management, and often any kind of output or outcome-based incentives is very dependent on the performance management that happens on an ongoing basis. So you need to have the people and the structures, the processes, the data set up to govern on an ongoing basis. And the several conversations I've had about this in the last several months of where things broke down, it tended to fall in this governance piece. We stood it up, we had all the story points figured out, we gave them a certain number, they only got X number, and then they didn't meet their performance, and then we paid them anyway, right? And that's just one of many stories. That ongoing governance, which is often not necessarily your sourcing organization, it may be a VMO, it may be a COE of some sorts that's managing, or it may just be operational resources managing the providers on a day-to-day basis. That has a huge impact in the success. So everybody really does need to be on the same page. And I think change management goes without saying in anything these days, any kind of change or project. You need to have the organizational communications and plan laid out and facilitate how each stakeholder is going to get involved and deliver the transition with the vendors as well. So when we think about infrastructure, we hit on Agile quite a bit. Just want to hit on next generation cloud and infrastructure services and some of the pricing and commercial models that we're seeing there. As portfolios are shifting and technology is shifting, the pricing models are evolving there as well. So what do we see when we look at cloud migration? We're starting to see, or we commonly see, models that are price per server migrated, price per database migrated, application migrated, could be for public cloud, per unit or percentage of public cloud services spend. For automation platforms, often price per incident resolved. For container management, you sometimes see price per container managed or price per pod, and also price per HCI node for HCI-based private cloud development. So thinking about these kind of per event or output-driven models and how they relate is really important as you're making this transition away from T&M. What is the right, not just the right model, but the right volume to contract for with your partners? Which leads into the next point, which is really about SLAs. And the better your service level agreements, the better you can tie in any kind of output, outcome, performance-driven contracting model. And the interesting evolution we're seeing here that I think is really promising is this evolution from service level agreements to experience level agreements. We're starting to see this in certain areas. But I would expect, as for the last few years, we've been talking about customer centricity and stakeholder centricity across business being a much bigger focus. In fact, if you go back to our key issues study at the beginning of 2020, as Michael mentioned, none of us could have forecast where we are, but the one question we asked was, whether things go well economically or whether we're in a recession, what will your priorities be? And customer centricity and customer experience really were number one regardless. And I think that has held up. I think as we look through COVID, we see that the experience of the customer has dominated in the business models that have been most successful. Even some really interesting emerging, localized remote delivery type business models across all kinds of consumer businesses. So when you think about that, shifting the way we measure service from an internal view to an experience level view makes a ton of sense. And it may be a hard pivot, but when we think about SLAs, we're going from, technical lenses, kind of the technical lens and the silo view to, and things like how do we keep the lights on, right? How fast can we resolve an incident? How do we measure defect leakage, agile team velocity, application availability, invoice processing accuracy, things like first pass match rate, that are traditional metrics that are measuring what I would call effectiveness, but from a very internal view. When we move to experience level agreements, we're starting to look at things that the user or the customer would view from a UX lens, right, on our performance. We're aggregating value aligned metrics, aligning with what is the ultimate outcome of the business and how do we measure service providers on that. It's a much more progressive view, and it's typically the accountability for those end customer outcomes is really distributed across a lot of different functions. So we start to see things like percent increase in first contact resolution, or reduction in time to market, or reduction in average handling time, critical business processes being measured in ways that are really different from a functional type view. So I personally think that's a really interesting evolution coming from kind of the more BPO, business process side. I think seeing how those metrics will evolve is very interesting, and pushing them out to our service providers to measure on the same scorecard we're evolving internally is going to be an interesting journey for a lot of companies. And with that, Michael, you want to jump into the next section?
So let's just jump right into some of the pricing. We're going to show you some numbers here. But before we go into numbers, we wanted to give you an opportunity to showcase some of our data, and one of the things we can do to help in the context of your organization and what's relevant right now is we can give you a slice of our data. And so what we've done is we've created what we call our price check. And so we've done this in the past, and we found it to be highly valuable for those that participate. So what we're going to do is say, listen, if you'd like to have a slice of our data for any of these three functions and select from a number of roles within those locations, or those functions and the locations here. And so if you're interested in getting one of this free of charge, all you got to do is let us know what you're interested in. Let me do it, and we'll send you an email link that will allow you to make your selections, and then we can revert the data back to you. So why don't we just click yes or no there, and if you're interested, please click it, and we'll go to the next slide then. All right,
Okay,
Abhishek, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks. So in terms of pricing trends, it's an interesting an interesting view we see, right? So for existing deals, providers are actually holding forth and resisting major discounts. Now, we've spoken in an earlier webinar as well that there's a lot of push by enterprises to get cost reductions on existing deals, but because at least our sense is that some of the input assumptions when those deals were signed were different, it becomes very difficult for vendors to really reduce the price just on a snap, right? So it becomes very difficult. Now, there are some elements, like cost of living adjustment waivers, addition of value adds, taking on more risk, which is happening on existing deals. But to say that a number of deals have just gone down in value for the same service by 20%, 15% would be wrong, right? So it's minuscule. On the other hand, for new deals, there seems to be a new paradigm of aggressive pricing, right? Now, what really could be driving this, right? A few of the things are the strong vendor consolidation sentiment in larger enterprises. Within managed services deals for AMS and capacity-based agreements, we're seeing multiple instances of like-for-like 10 to 15% fee reduction, right? What we would have seen in a similar scope last year. Right? Also important to consider that there's no more a desire to go for a gold-plated, platinum-plated solution, but hey, look at what really gets the effort done, gets the work done in as lean a way as possible, and then bake in some really sharp year-on-year adjustments. So again, two very different themes depending on whether we're talking about existing or new deals. If you move to another element of pricing, what are really the skills? And we've spoken about this as well previously. These are uncertain times. Pricing's under pressure, no doubt, right? But there are certain skills which have actually seen their demand and subsequently price go up in the recent past. Right? Some of these are cloud, SDN, database technologies, VDI, etc. Effectively, anything to do, anything which is much more in demand due to higher remote working, acceleration in the move to digital, right, preempted by COVID, is in demand. Whereas some others like RPA, VMware virtualization, traditional network management, clearly they're good skills, they're in-demand skills, but their demand seems to have stabilized, right, over the past 3 to 4 years. So they are actually witnessing a decrease in their pricing premium, potentially because there's a lot of the supply pool which has also been developed. So that dynamic needs to be kept in mind, and enterprises need to constantly keep on looking how much they're paying for what kind of skill. And we've seen some enterprises get some major benefits out of that constant recalibration. Another element to talk about, is FX, right? Now, FX rate discussions are normally straightforward. However, in the past few months, we've seen extreme depreciation in some currencies, as we've articulated them, specifically in India and Mexico. Brazil, of course, is a different story altogether. Yeah, if you look at the scale. Now, how it plays out is it could be in multiple formats, right? If the full or shared FX risk is with the enterprise, then it's more of a simple conversation that you look at the clause and then see how much of that benefit or windfall is shared. That's one. But even in cases where the risk is with the service provider, now technically the service provider will say, I've got the windfall because I've taken the risk, right? So that's my benefit. But we're seeing more and more enterprises actually go back and use that conversation to drive better discounting on existing deals, citing much of the conversation around Corona and impending business climate because of that. So that's an interesting construct we're seeing. Some other observations, we're also seeing these discussions being combined with cost of living adjustment waivers to see that, hey, you already got this benefit, Mr. Provider, because of FX. Can you give us a waiver for a couple of years? So these are all conversational. These are all discussion-based negotiations, which we're seeing much more frequently today as we did. Another thing that we want to point out is that enterprises are also expecting longer payment terms these days, right? This was specifically true for hard hit sectors, but it seems that all sectors have jumped into the fray. So we do anticipate this could become a medium-term trend, but only for those sectors which have a longer recovery cycle. As and when things start clearing up, we're sure that even service providers will push back to get them back from the 60 to 90 days back to the standard 30, 45, 60-day cycle. In some rare instances, we've also seen there's a set of clients who want to use the inverse and want to give early payments, but in lieu of a discount, right? So in situations where providers are already under pressure because of low cash flow, delayed payments, cash cycle, this may be an option where they might be willing to give a bit of a discount to get some early but again, it's rare. It's very, very selected companies who may be wanting to use their cash positions to drive discounts. Okay, so I mentioned that we do a couple of quick case studies, right? So this is one about which brings to the fore the importance of correct baselining, right? So in this, the current environment has acted as a catalyst to accelerate change. At first, right, it was around operational services and then the cost takeout, and enterprises are using this to drive structural changes. So this was the case where consumer goods company moved from FTE-based to transaction-based pricing, but the problem was a rather improper baselining, right? So which led the provider to bake in risk because they assumed the most complex scenario, right? Okay. Now the client was trying to pass on all the risk to the provider. They were saying, the terms like, well, you take it, you deliver it. Now that makes for good conversation, but when it comes to the brass tacks, then it becomes difficult. So the resolution with that had to be that there was a complete re-baselining of services into various complexity bands, and that ensured that the sudden spike in fees that they'd seen because of improper baseline was then rectified completely. So again, key learning: detailed baseline data is required, and there should be joint solution design trade-offs. It shouldn't be seen as just something which is a shortcut to lower costs. The second case study is something is a slightly different format. It's less about baselining or volumes, but it's more about how an insurance company took a very well-planned approach to negotiate hard without giving in to the urge of I quote, let's squeeze the last penny out. Right? They spent a lot of time in service quality indicators, looking at SLAs, prioritizing them, working with the vendors. They took an aggressive stance. They had some pretty stiff targets to meet in terms of cost cuts. But as they started the negotiation, they were well informed with what the market ranges are, and they knew that they would not go below a certain threshold. So that ensured that while they were negotiating hard, they wanted to get to a point. They weren't trying to push the vendors so hard that it either damages the relationship or it takes them to a point of cost cutting or cutting corners, which has service quality implications. So again, there are ways and means to drive targeted negotiations, and arming yourself with the right data from the word go is an example which is given good dividends to enterprises. Michael, back to you.
All right, so I'm going to do a quick wrap up. We have many pages of questions here. So next slide there. Okay, so let's talk about where we see things going. the controversies, things that Abhishek and Amy and the rest of the team will be looking at in the go forward time period here. Work from home obviously has become a big thing. The question is, what does that do in terms of impact to pricing and service levels? Initially, there was a focus in on actually trying to get more money to pay for the cost of doing that. But as we've talked to clients and asked of their expectations, what are they seeing in the work from home model? And we've actually seen a productivity improvement from people that are not having to make the long commutes. So we'll have to see how that works out of time and what that impacts pricing and who gets the benefit of that productivity improvement. Does that benefit accrue to the service provider, or does that benefit accrue back to the enterprise? And then the question will become, we talked a lot about moving to managed services. The question will be is, does that work, and how well does that work? And then will companies actually come back from that? So we'll be watching for that. There'll be we think there's still going to be cost pressures on, especially in the discretionary services. We think this is not going to be a one and done. The global pandemic is over on at the end of the year. It's going to continue and have legs on there, though we've seen some encouraging signs economically. But there's a possibility as we go forward here that there will be a longer term drag, especially in some industries. Vendor consolidation, something we're watching for, and we hear that. Really, there's two ways to look at that. One is what happens in the industry. Will the vendors consolidate themselves, or will enterprises look to consolidate their portfolios and reduce the number? We were talking to one client, they had like 80 different vendors, and they were looking to bring that substantially down into single digits. So there'll be more actions like that. And then the question of, how do we make sure we're getting a good deal and focusing on the benchmarking? And I know Abhishek and his team have been really busy trying to make sure that, not necessarily to make sure that it's the lowest possible price, but it represents a good deal and for both buyer and supplier. So anyway, those are things we're thinking about. With that, I said we have pages and pages of questions, so I want to try to jump to a few of those. Just as an explanatory, there were several questions on what is UX. Amy or Abhishek, do you want to address that one?
Yeah, I can answer that. UX is user experience, and user experience can mean a lot of things. It could be your internal end users, your internal stakeholders. It could also be external customers. But the term UX is kind of generally used here to talk about, the experience of the users or the customers that you're serving.
Okay.
Good question. Sorry for not spelling that out.
Yeah, another question here is around automation. How does automation impact? There's actually several questions on automation and the impact on these deals and pricing.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So a good question, right? So and this is an oft-asked question over the past 1 to 2 years. So one of the things to understand is, if you look at pricing in the most simplistic form, the total cost which a client pays can be looked as a P times Q, right? There's the price, for that unit or resource, and then there's number of units, right? Where we see automation impacting more is on the Q, because a lot of the effort which is required otherwise by humans gets reduced. So clearly, does it, for example, does it reduce the cost of an FTE or the billable work of an FTE? Perhaps not. We've seen cases where automation is implemented, but again the pricing model is more like a resource based. So it doesn't have as much of an impact on the FTE costs. If anything, the blended rate might slightly go up because the junior most slot is being replaced by automation. But it's the Q element, that's where it comes into play, and that's where over time it has some serious implications in terms of overall cost. Having said that, if the model is more about on a per unit pricing, that's more like an agglomeration of both P times Q, and that's where the overall things would come down. So again, material costs, but let's not expect that the billing rates could actually come down.
Yeah, Abhishek, and you can get me started on P times Q. This session's largely been focused on the price element of it, but I think most of the action and the upside volumes is on the Q side of the conversation. So when I was negotiating deals on the supply side, I always want my clients to focus in on, hey, if we can talk about price, that means they're not paying attention to the quantity, and that's where a huge amount of value can be derived through things like automation. focused in making sure that the right service levels are in place. There's all kinds of action over there. So with that, as I said, we've got pages and pages and pages of questions here. We're going to try to take those offline.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give Amy a chance here just to kind of do a one-page, what's her service all about and what's Abhishek's service is all about. So Amy, if you could just jump right there for that.
Sure, yeah. Let's just do a quick overview. A lot of the people on the line are probably either not familiar with Everest Group or not familiar with what we do for sourcing and VMO types of people, as well as for other groups like Global Business Services or IT. But just some of the newer memberships that we have, relatively newer, as part of our programs. We have both memberships and we can do short and long projects. There's actually a lot of flexibility in how we serve our clients. But the most popular one is Outsourcing Excellence, which is a market intelligence membership geared towards anyone who's looking at services, outsourced services, either ITS, IT services, or business process services. We have thousands of reports and deep research, as well as about 175 analysts focused on things like solution design or sourcing strategy, provider portfolios. We do quarterly risk reports and ratings of the top 25 providers. So a lot of information there really geared towards helping category managers or VMOs that are managing these providers. And that's where a lot of these questions come up that we've mentioned today. The second is pricing as a service, which is something Abhishek's team, our pricing assurance team, offers. They can do all kinds of price benchmarking projects, as well as looking at performance management, KPIs, SLAs, policy terms, contracting terms. They do that on a project basis. We've also very recently opened that up as more of an ongoing retainer-based membership. Part of the reason for that is we're seeing people go back and check on these things on a more frequent basis, and they want to have ongoing access to market-leading data. And that also includes some advice and consults with analysts on the pricing assurance team. So really high ROI on that kind of work and that kind of membership. So if anyone's interested in that, you can complete that CTA for a price check, or that slide, that little survey they put up, the poll for a price check, or you can reach out to us, and we're always happy to have a deeper conversation on where we help and how we help.
All right. So thank you, Amy and Abhishek. I wanted to put in a quick commercial here for the 2021 key issue study that we've just kicked off here last week. As it's our most popular study of the year, as both enterprises and service providers are starting to think about their plans for where we're going to go with 2021. So we'd like to hear from you, and we will be doing a follow-up webinar in December to kind of reveal those results. So click the link in the chat, and we'd appreciate that. And it's a pretty short survey, so please consider taking that. And with that, we'll do a wrap here. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you, Michael, Abhishek, Amy, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and all of our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.